It's my very, very great pleasure to introduce Andy Teitelman. We know Andy very well. He's led us in many song fests, and but I also know Andy as the co-chair of the Shanghai Chicago was it Social Services for Older Residents subcommittee. He co-chairs this with Phyllis Mitzen. We've been doing this now for about 8 years.
Yeah, since 2014.
Okay, 8 years is about right. Yeah, 6 maybe. And back before the pandemic, we alternated years of 1 year we would send a delegation to Shanghai, and the next year we would host a delegation from Shanghai. And the idea is that we each share our best practices on what we do to take care of our older population. Andy is an ideal person for doing this, having devoted his career to helping older people age in place and comfortably. What you work for? Housing.
Yeah, I worked for Metropolitan Family Services and then the Chicago Housing Authority with the senior services section.
And now you've grown into your job.
Yeah. Now I do it because I love it.
Yeah. Well, you brought us to a good place. And he shares the co-chairmanship with Phyllis Mitzen, who unfortunately could not be with us today because of the very untimely death of a very close friend and the services going on at this very moment. And Phyllis has been active also, has devoted her career to aging issues, and she's very prominent in promoting it both locally and on the state level. And so we have two very qualified people to lead our group and to represent Chicago. And we welcome Andy to tell us about what they've been doing. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Susan. And Lucas, I think we can just begin with the slides and work our way through. As Susan said, she and Phyllis Mitzen and I are members of this Chicago Sister Cities International Shanghai Social Services Exchange Committee. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Chicago Sister Cities, I think, is well known, at least as an idea. Chicago has 28 of these cities around the world that are sister cities, but only 7 of them have a subcommittee that focuses on social services. And you can see the list there in front of you. Shanghai is the one that we are part of, and it's the only exchange that focuses solely on aging. As you might be interested in knowing, and I hope that we will see one soon, but an ACE Social Services Exchange was in the works with Kyiv, but understandably was put on hold with the conflicts there. So, and Sister Cities is part of a larger City of Chicago effort called World Business Chicago. So next slide. So Phyllis and I talked about this. It's a pretty bold step to say, let's take 1 minute on China. But we want to go from the broad to the specific about what we're doing and just set some context. So just as a brief look, you can see on this map on the left that most of the population of 1.36 billion people in China is in about 1/3 of the country, and just a few that are in the other 2/3, which is much more rural. So most is in the eastern part of the country. There's just, there are 23 provinces. Shanghai is one of 4 municipalities, and then there are some autonomous regions, and just amazing history, which we only got a taste of when we would go to the China Museum or something like that while we were visiting. But if you look at these numbers, 83 dynasties, 397 emperors, and 162 kings, you can't even begin to talk about the country without planning an entire seminar. So we decided to only say a few words. The other thing I wanted to tell you that is so important to the country today is, since the communist regime began in 1949-50, they implemented what had been going on in Russia, are these 5-year plans. And everything is nationally directed and then carried out locally. So if our calculations are right, they're in their 15th, but you can do your own division on that. And then the slide on the right, as we begin to talk about Shanghai, that's an area, a beautiful area. If you've been there before or seen things, the river is, you just see a peak of the river, and then look at all those people along this walking area called the Bund. We unfortunately never had to walk when there were quite so many people walking there, but that was some national holiday when that photo was taken. Next slide. So to begin to talk about Shanghai, we'll just look at this briefly. So I mentioned that there are districts, there are 24 million people in Shanghai, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how that's broken up. And you can see in the orange, that's the new section when you see photos or have been there, the Pudong area. And then we went to many of these districts as we were taken around to see how they are practicing and helping communities with the older adults. Next slide. So those were the districts we saw in the map. And just a couple of comments about this 24 million people. It's hard to get your mind around it. But China has 10 cities with over 10 million people in them. I'm not sure, other than New York approaching it, that we have any in this country that are that large. They distinguish in Shanghai between their residents and their migrants. So 14 million are residents. That means they're native to Shanghai and they're eligible for the municipal benefits that come with being a resident. Nearly 10 million are what they call migrants, and they are not from other countries, but they're from other parts of China, some of those rural parts often that we saw on that map at the beginning. And they do not have the benefits of from Shanghai. They have to receive those back in their provinces. And there are many, many issues around that. We'll talk a little about workforce later on in the presentation. But just to give you some comparison, here in Chicago, we have in the city proper under 3 million. And in the metro area, we have 9 million. So in Illinois, we have almost 13 million. So thinking about a city with 24 million begins to give you an idea of the scale of that city. We were told that they have, by our hosts, which we'll tell you more about in a minute, that they have 660 elderly homes with 115,000 beds. They have a 10-year objective to have beds for 3% of the population. And then they're highly organized with teams of what they call, and maybe a translation issue, but and when they speak, the translator would speak English to us. She would tell us about the old people. So here we might say seniors, or the elderly, or people who are aging in place. In Shanghai, their translation of what they're talking about are the old people, but nothing derogatory about that, just a distinction of age. So there are 15,000 teams of old people. They do dance, they do Tai Chi. There are 200,000 volunteers. And perhaps because everything is either organized by, or at least approved by, the government, they always seem to know their numbers. And that was one thing we noted. If you asked someone here how many facilities are there for seniors, there would be few people who could tell you that in our city or our state. But in China, they know their numbers. Next slide. So as we went as a delegation, our committee always planned. Some of you may know, who know Susan, know that she had family there. So she was often there, and then decided that she didn't need to take a spot as a delegate, but we were often there at the same time. But in planning and then in going there as a delegation, our approach was to try not to compare what we saw or learned while we were in China about their approach and their thoughts about things, but just to understand. And we refer to it as cultural humility, that things are different, not better or worse. So there were many things that were different in their policies and philosophies, not were, I should say, are. We learned a lot about an overall philosophy of social harmony and trying to achieve that, of the importance of following through on obligation, and also, as they explained to us, the concept of shame. And currently, that's perhaps not as pervasive in the present day. And one of the changes in their culture, as young people have been more exposed to Western culture, that shame is not as effective a philosophy in the social harmony of the culture as it once was. And because of things changing with obligation, around the time of our first visit in 2015, there had been a relatively new law called filial piety, and it required young people to visit their parents on a somewhat regular basis, once or twice a year. And then probably the most well-known policy was the one-child policy, which notably ended the week that we were there in our first visit in 2015. So jokingly, we said that we ended the one-child policy, but hardly true. I'm going to keep talking through this presentation. I think that's right. I thought I heard a question, so I hope that you will hang on to those, and we'll work our way through and have plenty of time to discuss. And then the 5-year planning cycle. Whenever we would meet, we had mutual questions. They wanted to know about us, but we wanted to know about them. What was the structure of the government, and how did the money flow? What kind of public and private insurance existed? And they were particularly interested in the role of what they call, and often organizations in Europe refer to as NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And they're quite behind chronologically where we are in terms of not-for-profits and the role they play in social services. So they were particularly interested as the family role in providing services and taking care of its own began to change, had begun to change, because with the one-child policy, there were not enough adult children to take care of a increasingly older family population, and the government can't keep up, can't replace those needs. So they're trying to understand and working very hard at learning the models that we have in Chicago and actually around the world to learn how does a government partner with not-for-profits to deliver services. Next slide. So we had 3 visits, as Susan said in the introductions, in 2015, 2017, and 2019. Each time they invited us to select 8 Chicago delegates. We had applications. We looked for a diversity of our delegates, so a social service core, but to be multidisciplinary. So we had always had social workers, we had a doctor each time, we had attorneys, particularly from the Cook County Guardian's office. And we would have specialties such as hospice and dementia, but we would pay attention to what our hosts in Shanghai would ask us about to be sure we had some specialization in the areas that they were interested in. The way this works, and we hope it will start again post-pandemic, perhaps next year, is that each delegate pays for their own airfare when we go, but once we get there, all our expenses are paid. And in their case, the government provides those funds. When it's reversed, and we had delegations come here in 2014, 16, and 18, and we're hopeful to start that cycle again, we would raise money privately to fund the lodging and meals, and they would get themselves to Chicago. Next slide. And we'll just go quickly on this. This is the agency that hosted us. It's a very large social service agency. It's perhaps, if anything, akin to the State Department of Human Services here in Illinois. But they have all sorts of things they're responsible for. Our interface was with the staff that oversees old age programs and social work programs. Next slide. So finally, the background is done, and let me take you through a few moments of talking about what we would do and what we learned while we were there. We would have daily visits to places and offices serving older adults. This picture, I'm pretty sure, is a first day where we had an overview and we were in a central office. And you can see me at the head of the table, and kitty corner from me at the corner was the head of their delegation, someone we referred to by an American name of William. And where you sat was very important, and it had to do with who the delegation lead was and who the Chinese organization being visited was. And they used nameplates, and everything flowed from top down. The major issues we talked about or looked at on every day of every visit, which usually began at 8:30 in the morning, and we would be dropped back at our hotel for a little change of clothing or something before dinner at 6 or 7. was their rapidly growing aging population and their slow growing younger population that we talked about. And we were always talking about ways to address the issues of aging in place in the communities in light of what they were seeing as the changing culture in the city. Talked a moment about the migrants before, but the interesting thing is they had to prioritize. So the people who would get services, they described to us as the 3 no's, and that was a qualifying thing. So many older adults, 30% of the population, nearly. But if someone had no family, no home, and no money, then they were at the top of their list and prioritized for services. So there's still a great deal of responsibility that the families have. And they were tremendously interested in our Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security systems. They do not have these systems. And as I said earlier, they were interested in the not-for-profits. And a lot of work which we saw grow rapidly over the 6 years that we had our 3 visits, the increase of community-based care and social workers versus solely having institutionalization. Next slide. So when we would go, like we're visiting a sub-district, and they would put up a little presentation. This, you can see me, the back of me in this picture, and this wonderful woman to my right is Esther Wong. She sadly passed away last year. Esther was the director of the Chinese American Service League for many years in partnership with Bernie Wong, who also passed away the year prior. We learned about how they mapped their district in this case, and how they made sure that between volunteers and staff that everybody who needed services could be had. And this was a particular district where they were reaching out into the community. And then, fascinating to us, this picture of the robot and one of our delegate members, Nancy Flowers, this was from 2019. And this robot could recognize the residents by their voice. It had a database of their medical conditions, and it could ask them questions how they were, and it could also have some fun with them. And this is where, there's a lot of controversy now about AI. And this is probably before we've seen so much of that in our country. But with our cultural humility approach, we just wanted to understand how it worked. And we watched and listened to how they utilized the robot to make sure that people who were coming to interact with it would be flagged if there were some issues, and then a human intervention would be planned. Besides and then it was kind of cute because they had us talk to the robot. It was able to speak English for some reason. Next slide. So we went to several districts. I'm going to have a couple of maps for you, but just to show you, here's an institutional setting. The beds are quite close together. There's not such a thing as a private room. People seemed quite happy to have the care, those that were in the institutions. And one thought we had that throughout our visits to Shanghai, there's so many people there. And perhaps because of that, the sense of personal space is different than ours in Chicago. Just give you a little anecdote. People are not uncomfortable being close to one another. And when I was first walking down Nanjing Road, which we'll see in a few minutes, and just people everywhere around me and very close, I was wondering if someone was doing one of the pickpocket scams that we think about when someone gets that close to us in Chicago. But there, the culture is different and people are quite comfortable being close to one another. On the right is a slide of just meeting one of the participants. This is Naoko, who is a Japanese American professor of social services and older adult services at UIC, who is a member of our delegation. Next slide. So, and then we would visit and see some of the activities. So you see a mahjong, I think I heard in your announcements, and the game day, there was some mahjong going on. So you want to see the experts, go there. And Lucas, I don't know if it's possible to take the slide down for 1 second and I could show something.
Absolutely. Here we go.
So everywhere we went, they wanted to give us something. And this beautiful fan had just been painted at one of these homes that we visited. And I felt like, boy, I shouldn't be taking this. Look at the time that had to be taken to paint this beautiful scene. But there was nothing that gave this person more pleasure than providing me our delegation, but me as the leader of the delegation with this gift. If Phyllis had been here and when we were preparing this together, and I wish I had known, and she had known that she couldn't join us today because she wanted to show you this little dog that was made of, that she received in 2017, that she always has on a shelf, that is made of tiny little beads. And so there's a lot of attention to activity, and people were busy and feeling quite good about what they were doing. So end of show and tell. Let's go back to the slides. How are we doing on time? We might need to speed up a little bit. Next slide. So I just wanted to raise this without going into it, but we talked about the migrant workers, and what struck us is the immigrant issues are not that different, except that their immigrants are coming from within China, not from other countries. There are dialect differences, there are questions about benefits, there's, you know, what's the path to citizenship? There's housing issues. They're all the same kinds of issues, but there's a tremendous need in the workforce for the migrants who are quite willing to be the health and home care workers. And that is not as appealing job to the quote residents of Shanghai. Next slide. And also just a quick thing to show you that a relatively new aspect in Shanghai was an elder court. And we were fortunate to have representatives in each delegation from the Cook County Public Guardian's Office. And there was a lot of questions to our attorney from the Cook County Guardian's Office about public guardianship, because we're coming from they are coming from thousands of years of filial piety, of the family taking care of its own. And with these changes, these massive cultural changes of not enough children to take care of their own, not more exposure of children to the Western world and desire to move on and do things, more interest on the part of young people to move, particularly to the urban areas, that an institution like Elder Court was brand new relatively brand new in the city of Shanghai. So fascinating to me as a social worker. So the next slide, the last comment I just want to make about this before a few fun things I'd like to show you. When we visited, we just were, by keeping our minds open, we were just amazed at how open our hosts, the Shanghai Civil Affairs Bureau, are about their successes and challenges they face. We are so impressed at how they wanted specific information from us 1 year. And when we would visit 2 years later, we could see when they had decided to adopt something, how they adapted it to their cultural and demographic needs. Like the community services and how they could integrate volunteers into that. And we're also so impressed with some of the ongoing culture of Shanghai, with the lifestyle that people there really focus on their health. Older adults take care of themselves, and there's so much attention to exercise and socialization that there seems to be, and of course we don't know, China is so immense, but there seems to be a really good sense of people feeling happy as they grow older there. But there were also similarities of the problems we have. The big challenge here about, which is older, been going on, I would say only since the 1970s, but the refocus on community-based services versus institutionalization. They're seeing that now. And they have the same kinds of issues that we see with siloed medical, health, and social services. So there are different departments and different divisions, and they don't always talk to one another. Okay, next slide. So despite all the seriousness, we had some time for fun and tourism too. If those of you probably on the call may all know Phyllis Mitzen, but she's right there in the middle. And that's that modern part of Shanghai across the river behind them. And they're on the Bund. And that's the area with the first picture that had so many people you could not see 1 ounce of concrete. So we loved doing that. They allowed us to stay in hotels that were walkable to there. Next slide. Shanghai is a city of contrasts. There's the ancient, and you can see that here on the left with the boat and a village and the temple in front of us. But if you look, sort of squint a little bit and look at that line sticking up right next to the temple, that's that same skyscraper with the genie gang style architecture that's you see there on the right. So they have the ultra modern and they have the ancient as well. Next slide. So I had mentioned to you about walking on this wonderful road called Nanjing Road. It's closed to traffic except for some trolleys. And it's quite commercial and very busy and really lively. And then, as Phyllis pointed out, in 2015, I think, or 2017, she took that picture. It was the largest Apple store she had seen. But I think we think there's some bigger ones now. But it was, if you sort of look, you can see, can't even tell where the people are outside and where they're inside. It was just filled with people. Okay, next slide. We ate a lot of interesting foods. Our experience is the food in Shanghai that's Chinese is not the same as the Cantonese or Szechuan restaurants that we might be accustomed to going to in Chicago. But we were quite confused at first until we learned that the first set of food that came out was not the end of things, and we learned to pace ourselves a little bit. They would bring out cold dishes, and then there would be hot dishes. There would be dessert, which was very seldom sweet, like a dessert soup or some fruit. And then there would also be, soup and fruit. And everything would be a lazy Susan. They were usually tables of 10. And we all got the hang of using chopsticks. We were never provided with Western utensils of forks or knives. Next slide. So this is, Luke, is going to be three kind of quick slides in a row. But this is where we could see firsthand how exercise was a part of the culture. So if you see this group, this is probably 5:30 or 6 in the morning doing Tai Chi. And we saw these groups all over the city because if we wanted to get out and walk, we had to do it before we had to get back and change into our professional attire and be ready to be picked up at 8 a.m. and eat a little something. So we went out early to walk around and see the city, and they would be out before us. On the right is one of the parks, and I think this one is actually People's Park. But it was a map of all the exercise stations they had there. So then if you look at the next slide, we just couldn't resist. They had adult exercise equipment everywhere, and so many people using them and so active. And then there would be people playing badminton without a net, nearby in the park part of the area, but we couldn't resist. So that's Phyllis on the right, and I don't know who's in, but in the final slide, Phyllis particularly just championed getting some of this adult exercise equipment into a park. She lives on the north side, so she worked with her aldermen, and this is some of us at the opening of this Chicago park, where we were able to implement some of the things that we saw. So far, the Chicago Park District had, so far that we know, I guess a year ago, had 3 of these installed. This one is Lakeshore Park with plans for more. So I encourage you to get with your alderperson and your park district folks if you want, if they're not there already, and get that. Next slide. So we encountered some interesting customs. When we first saw these, especially some of the women were a little bit surprised, but these are very typical toilets. But then on a less amused note, Dr. Dong, who was a gerontologist who was with us on the first visit, was telling us that there's very little incidence of incontinence in China. And this is because this toilet requires squatting rather than sitting or standing, so that the muscle tone as we age is much stronger in the people in China, and thus they have a better, a researched better ability to stand up, sit down, and frankly, bladder control. So just interesting things that you learn while you're having to take care of your needs when you're going from one meeting to a next. Next slide. Just a few more. We had the opportunity to see customs. On the right was a group all of older adults in one of the provinces who were interested in being part of an acting troupe, and they had put on a performance, and then they wanted to pose a picture with us, but it was just a beautiful thing, all volunteer. On the left is here in Chicago when they visited us, and Susan is prominently displayed, I think, aren't you, on the right in the front in the blue. I'm in this photo as well, but what we did with this is we said we want to learn about each other's culture. So they sang us one typical Chinese folk song about the moonlight and a young man wooing a young woman. And we sang them This Land Is Your Land by Woody Guthrie. Next slide. I also wanted to share with you that after the tour of our first delegation, some of us went on a walking tour led through Jewish Shanghai, and it was just fascinating. There's been some of this at the University of Chicago a few years ago, and some at the Holocaust Museum in Skokie. But Jews were not welcome everywhere during World War II. And one of the places they were welcome was Shanghai. But when they got there, that was the moment that the Japanese had allied with the Germans and had occupied Shanghai. And they basically interred the Jews into another ghetto. And it wasn't until after the war that things changed for the Jewish population in that city. Next slide. So since the pandemic, just having this relationship, we're part of the larger China committee, our social services group. They sent a lot of those N95 masks at a time, if we all recall, when it was told that we needed them, but they were hard to come by. For social services, we've maintained regular contact with our partners at the Civil Affairs Bureau. We've had 3 virtual conferences with them with a mutually developed agenda. We'll probably have one more this fall, and we hope to resume in-person delegations, both directions, next year, probably at the latest the following year. So finally, last slide. During the pandemic, we thought it was hard to do a lot, so we got our delegates together, and one of a former staff person of Chicago Sister Cities and a small committee of ours did focus groups with people who had been on the delegations. And we had just all of it's captured and recorded like today's Zoom recording, but we have a report, and there were some key takeaways. One is that exposure, I would say, to another culture, but our exposure to the Chinese culture and developing international relationships is priceless. the similarities and the differences are just a beautiful part of one's sense of the world. Secondly, sharing information and lessons learned has provided an opportunity for a ripple effect, as we mentioned, in Shanghai, but also here in Chicago. Delegates have published articles that they have reported that it changes how they approach their work. People have made presentations and professional conferences, and one group successfully received grant funding as a result of their visit. And then laughingly, we, as a Chicago group, we'd say, well, you had to go all the way to China to meet my Chicago colleagues. But truthfully, the 25 or so of us that have been on this committee over the years and had an opportunity to go have bonded, and it's led to new professional and personal relationships that we believe improve services in untold way. So last slide, just a beautiful view of Shanghai, the modern part, at night with some boats on the river. So I thank you so much, and let's have questions.
No,
think
I don't see any in the chat yet.
There
Anybody-
is one. Where do the, and I can't say the word UYGHUR fit into the overall population?
I have to say, I'm not familiar with that term, and I would love to learn about it from the asker, but I don't know unless, what
They're
is
the
that?
ones who are highly discriminated against, and they speak a different dialect.
Okay.
Oh, the
So-
Uyghur. Oh, the Uyghur.
The Uyghur, I
Oh.
think, yeah, are they part of the migrant
They're the
group?
ones from
Susan, do you
Xinjiang.
think?
They're the ones from Xinjiang, from the Northwest.
Okay,
We didn't really have much contact with what was going on outside of China, outside of Shanghai is.
right. Okay. Other questions or comments?
Well, I mean, it's interesting the way we're both sides are committed to taking care of our older population. We come at it from different angles, perspectives because of our cultures. And it's just the way we interacted. I think we just learned so much more than we ever expected, just
Yes.
the way it, sort of.
Mhm. I'm wondering if anything surprised anyone in what you heard today, either about what you know or what you weren't previously aware of. Any thoughts on that?
Well,
We
my
were
picture,
surprised every day. Yeah.
my
What's that?
picture has gone cockeyed. Can you hear me? Oh,
Yes, I
Okay,
think
I-
I see that one. Yes.
yeah, well, my camera's crazy, but thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. And of course, we all know and love Susan and think of China, but that's about all I know about China. So I wasn't sure I was going to be all that interested, but I was very interested. And part of that's your presentation, and part of it's just learning about something that I know nothing of.
Oh, great.
So
Well,
I certainly hope you get to start again.
yes.
I'm sure it's good for both countries to be able to do
Mhm.
those kinds of things.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And we're just so pleased that our partners have been willing and have been able, with all that they have been going through with the pandemic that all of us have read
Uh-huh.
about or know, the little bit we know about from the news with their their efforts to have zero COVID overwhelmed our partners at the Shanghai Civil Affairs Bureau, but even still, they would take the time to email us and say, we can't talk now, how about, something later. I see that comment. I just thought that made so much sense and absolutely true. Absolutely. Yes.
Lucas and Susan, maybe they could start working on that with Augustana.
Change all our
I will
bathrooms.
say, I was in Padua, Italy, and they had the same kind of toileting system where you had to squat.
So, and
What's the age rate, the longevity age range?
I don't have that in front of me, but they're just like here, living longer and longer. So Susan, do you know?
I don't.
It's just moving. I know what we were told is it continues to move up. And so people are living longer, more healthily, and there are fewer people to take care of them is what the perspective that they wanted to talk to us about. I know
So
there is
what's
a
really
question.
interesting.
It's not
Yeah,
a question. I
Yeah.
was just fascinated that you made such a conscious effort not to be judgmental culturally. That is such a hard thing to
It
do.
was really
And
hard.
the Chinese, I mean, my daughter lived in China, so we visited several times, and it's very hard. You tend to want to put things in your own frame of reference, and you just can't do that. I'm sure you had a hard time, but I'm very pleased to hear that you made such an effort on that.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think it helped us appreciate another way of doing things.
Right.
And they got a few years on us for figuring out how to do stuff with, thousands of years versus less than 300 that we have in this country.
What's really interesting, I don't know if you want to give a little anecdote about the one-child policy, and this is, of course, a really serious impact on present-day China. But Phyllis told us about going through the park and all the mothers there with signs trying to find wives for their sons.
Oh,
Yeah.
I saw those.
We also talk about our very unscientific sample of the number of people we talk to when the one-child policy was expanded to 2, which meant the young people who were on the staff of the Civil Affairs Bureau, but none of them wanted to have more children.
Yeah.
So they were our sample, which is ridiculous, but the people we talked to who were professionals were so committed to raising their child in the best way possible. And that meant that they did not feel they could afford to have additional children. And I would say maybe a half a dozen separate conversations with, contacts that we had, thinking that the people might be excited that they were no longer restricted. But that wasn't the case now, that for a policy, it succeeded in limiting the population, and it failed in that there are not enough young people to take care of their families. And, no one expected people to keep living longer and longer. But it worked in that the culture believes still the people we spoke with, they believe it's the best way to just have one child. Susan, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, but.
So, I mean, it's a huge issue, of course.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's somewhat true here. I mean, we're having smaller families too, and we talk about the sandwich generation of
Mhm.
people taking care of their parents and their children, and it's a
So
bigger
we,
issue than just China or us.
yes, Mr. Parker? You're on mute. You're muted.
Mr. Parker, you're muted.
There
Okay,
you go.
you might be interested to know
Can
that
can we unmute him?
He's
Yes.
unmuted now.
I'm unmuted now, I think. You might be interested to know that in Singapore, which is about 3/4 ethnic Chinese, they have laws that promote familial piety. For example, they have a court, just as the court you mentioned in Shanghai, where if the parents feel that they've been neglected, they can take their kids to court and the
Oh.
court adjudicates. It works the other way too. If the
Wow,
kids
interesting.
think the parents aren't sufficiently familial, they can go to the same court and it intercedes again.
That's,
They also, most people buy their apartments from buildings made by the government. And if
mhm.
a child buys his or her apartment within a certain distance of the parents, they get a discount because the government buys and sells these apartments.
Okay.
And so if you get close enough to your family to take care of your parents,
Mhm.
you get about a 10 or 15% discount on the
Oh,
price.
fascinating.
Mhm.
Thank you for sharing that.
So,
By the way, the anthropological term for the tendency to judge other cultures by our own, assuming the way we do things is the best, is ethnocentrism,
Yes.
a term you've probably heard.
Mhm.
It was a
so, Andy, you've had several people. Oh, I'm still on mute.
I'm
No.
just looking, I can't tell if that's a hand up of the person who has Galaxy tab or if it's just up because I didn't know if anyone else had. Okay.
I was just going to comment that you've, since the beginning, we've had contact with some of the same people. Are they, but William is now transferred to another position?
He's still in the same department, but he's promoted to a higher level. So they copy him on their correspondence, but we have a new contact.
But do we still have contact with some of the other people that are the same?
Yeah, a lot of the same people. Yeah.
Because, I mean, I think this has been interesting, the continuity that we've had.
Mhm.
You and Phyllis have both been on the trip from the beginning, and they've had some of the same people,
Yeah.
so that there's sort of a depth as well as the exchange of the moment.
Right. And these virtual exchanges, as Susan, you know, they've been challenging to do because everyone wants to have a really good discussion, but we have to hear about the topic first, and then we have to translate whatever
Oh,
we
yeah.
say. So we have to have interpreters, and everything takes double the time. So if you have 3 topics and 3 15-minute presentations, that's 3 30-minute presentations by the time the translation's done. And there's 90 minutes right
Right.
there. So it's much easier to spend days together than to have the virtual, but at least we've been able to maintain the relationships until that can happen again.
Very good.
Terry, did you have another question?
No, I asked mine.
I take your hand down.
Oh, good.
Anyway, I'm really
We thank you.
happy at your interest, and Phyllis is so sorry that this conflict arose, but we all understand that when there's a death of an important person, you have to go and support their family. So she'll be happy to hear that there was interest.
Very much.
Very much.
Andy,
Thank you.
thank you so very much. I think this has been very, very interesting, very enlightening. And it just shows us how much more we have to learn from each other, from other cultures. I'm
Amen.
glad that we can continue to do, I'm just looking forward to more trips and more reports back.
Great.
Very
Okay.
good.
And
Thank you.
before we sign off, we will see Andy again at our holiday season drop-in in December. He will be leading us in holiday songs again, so we'll see him again. And
Very good.
I see Laura is on, so after Ann bids us farewell, Laura can start the connect and chat for anybody who wants to stay on.
Okay.
Well, we really
you,
thank
Andy.
you
Very
so
nice.
much, Andy. It was
Okay,
wonderful.
thank you.
you.
I
Thank you.
learned a lot.
Great.
Thanks for your time.
And I will try to say, which is thank you in Mandarin Chinese. Xie xie. How is that? Is that good, Susan?
Very good.
Xie xie.
Thank you.
Okay,
All right.
goodbye.
That was
Goodbye.
Thanks
great.
again. See you
Bye-bye.
in
Yeah, I can.
December, if not before. Bye-bye.